Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rev 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair Rev 250's advisory group. And our guest today is Kathleen Duval, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you.
And your most recent book, I think, is Independence. Well, you do have a book since then, but Independence Lost, on the lives on the edge of the American Revolution. So it looks at the revolution from a somewhat, an interesting perspective, not from the standpoint of Boston or Virginia, but from the standpoint of the Gulf Coast. So what's different when you look at the revolution from that perspective as opposed to the more East Coast centric one?
Right. So the first thing is who's involved in it. And so the battles that were fought on the Gulf Coast were fought not between different parts of the British Empire, if you will, between the rebels and the British Crown forces, but instead mostly between the Spanish on one side and the British on the other. So basically Spain, like France, took advantage of the rebellion, this war within the British Empire, to strike at its, by then, fairly long-time enemy, Britain, and try to seize colonies from Britain. So there's not only different people involved, the Spanish involved here, it's also a different sort of motivation for the Spanish. The Spanish get involved in the American Revolution in many ways for empire, to spread their empire. Mm-hmm. And then also along the Gulf Coast and in the sort of interior regions connected to the Gulf Coast, there are very strong native nations. Of course, there are native nations involved in the war on the Atlantic coast as well. But these are southeastern native nations, particularly the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Creeks or Muskogees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you begin the book highlighting some interesting characters, and among them are Alexander MacGillivray and Pushmataha. And so it's fascinating to look at the revolution from their perspective, because they're on somewhat different sides and for different reasons. So you do get at the motivations of these various characters.
Yeah, that's right. So the other another major difference with the war on the Atlantic coast are that the motivations of native nations who get involved, and sort of on the most general sense, they get involved in the American Revolution in ways that support their own independence, and particularly their national independence, whether that's the Choctaws or the Creeks or the Chickasaws. And so in the book, that's right, I follow 8 main characters. It's such a complicated and unknown part of the war, and really place in the 18th century, not a place and not a group of peoples that many readers will already know going in. So I use these characters to try to help people follow what's going on. And so 2 of the characters, as you say, are Pushmataha and Alexander MacGillivray. Both are native leaders. Pushmataha is Chickasaw. Alexander MacGillivray is a Scottish father. That's why that's his name. But he's a Creek leader. He is fully Creek as well. He's Creek through his mother's family. And they go into the war for quite different reasons, even though both have that sort of general motivation of their own native nation's independence. And so they show us different men making decisions for reasons different from each other, even though they seem more similar, and then reasons that are different from what we usually expect.
Yeah. So what were the Creeks doing in this period? I mean, it's
So I think what maybe the most important thing to kind of understand about the 18th century is that nations like the Creeks still had their own country. They were still in charge in their place. So you could look at a European map. I use this in my teaching a lot. You look at a European map, and Europeans say they've divided up the continent, right? The middle is French, the east is British, the west is Spanish, and the south is all Spanish, right? But even on those maps, even on those European maps, if you scope in, you'll see sort of under the big French label or British label, underneath that are hundreds of names of native nations, and it really is still their country in those places. So that was true of the Creeks on the verge of the American Revolution. But on their eastern border, they're beginning to see illegal settlements spreading out, particularly of the Carolinas and Georgia in their territory. And so that's something Alexander MacGillivray and other Creeks are thinking of seriously when they consider the revolution.
Yeah. And then you end after 1814. Of course, by then, everything has changed for the Creeks. They've lost the war with the Americans.
Right. So this is the revolution is sort of the beginning of, what you could see as that still multi-decade path toward what we know is coming, which is Indian removal, which removes most of the Creeks as well as most southeastern Indians. But it hasn't happened yet at all in 1776.
Yeah. And you were telling me earlier you got to this topic growing up in Arkansas and thinking, here's a place that doesn't have much history, but you found out it actually does. And your first book, the Native Ground, really does explore that, the importance of these different nations in that part of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I sort of went to graduate school wanting to do something that showed interactions between Europeans and Native Americans. And I was in grad school in California. I didn't really think I would end up back in Arkansas for research, but I did. And then I think, the Spanish and the French had a presence there, but they didn't have many soldiers. They certainly didn't have many settlers. And so looking at the middle of the continent for my first book really gave me this opportunity to have documents that were written by French and Spanish officials who wrote lots and lots of reports, but were writing them really about the power of Native Americans, of Native nations there, and really reveal with every letter they wrote, from their little posts in Arkansas and Louisiana and what's now Missouri, that they were outnumbered and definitely not in charge. And so I got sort of really came to see the continent in a new way, that it, that you can see it as British population growing, the Atlantic colonies, and then the eventual spread of their descendants as the United States across the continent. You can see it that way. That's a true story. But with a different angle, if you start in the middle of the country, you start on the Gulf Coast, you see how much longer a period, the sort of colonial period was, how long it takes Europeans to actually colonize the continent, and really a process that's still that's still ongoing. There's still hundreds of native nations in the United States today.
There are, yes. And also, Bernardo Galvez is an important figure in this and operates somewhat differently from the British governors of West Florida. So, what can you tell us about him?
Yeah, right. So Bernardo de Galvez was a young general. He was appointed to be governor of Louisiana. So one of the sort of complicated things about this story is we think of Louisiana, the colony of Louisiana, as being French, and it was until the 7 Years' War, that war that ends in the early 1760s before the American Revolution. So Louisiana, before the 7 Years' War, Louisiana was both sides of the Mississippi River. At the end of the 7 Years' War, France has to clear out of that completely. Spain takes the western half and Britain takes the eastern half. So suddenly Spain and Britain, their colonies are facing each other across the Mississippi River. None of those colonies, British West Florida on the east side, Spanish Louisiana on the west side, neither of them have many colonists, but that becomes this international imperial border. Bernardo de Galvez, as this young man, gets appointed to be governor of Louisiana, very ambitious, and so that motivation of Spain to expand the Spanish Empire even further. It's huge, right? In 1776, the Spanish Empire is gigantic. They want to make it even bigger, and Galvez, he's on the border of on the frontier of the Spanish Empire, and he wants to push it even farther north, farther east into North America. And so he is the general who leads the Spanish effort in the battles against Britain. And we're not going to go ahead and spoil it because nobody knows this, but Spain wins these battles, beats Britain in the Battle of Mobile, Pensacola, various posts, Baton Rouge and Natchez along the Mississippi River. And at the end of the American Revolution, Galvez and the Spanish crown really believe that they've won the American Revolution, and that most of North America north of Mexico will be Spanish colonies. You're not envisioning at all that it will be the United States, except that little sliver, those 13 colonies hanging on to the Atlantic.
The negotiations, the French and the Spanish are pushing for a very eastern boundary of the United States, and the British and the Americans actually side with each other and saying, no, the Mississippi River.
Yes, exactly. Because of course Britain is going to be on the opposite side of France and Spain in anything it can, even if
Yeah.
it means siding with the colonists who recently won a rebellion against them.
Right. Yeah. And then you have some folks who do choose the Oliver Pollock and Margaret O'Brien, who are folks who are become part of the Spanish world and when they've moved out there. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that they reveal is the sort of multicultural, multinational, multilingual nature of the Spanish Empire, and it's true of other empires in this era as well. But they both were both from Ireland. She was born Catholic, belongs to a strident Catholic family who left Ireland. Her father left Ireland to fight for the French, right, to fight for Catholics in the world against Britain, and in hopes of gaining Irish independence. Pollock's family was Irish Protestant and comes a very different path, comes to Philadelphia, just much more similarly to other British colonists, but ends up a series of good, or I guess, good luck and good business decisions, establishes a shipping business, and a really successful shipping business, shipping in ports that really, under the Navigation Acts aren't really supposed to be trading with each other. But he trades between Philadelphia, Havana, and New Orleans. Havana and New Orleans being both Spanish at this point.
Right.
And then ends up in New Orleans when the war starts, and really tries to push the Spanish government, and successfully in some ways pushes Galvez and the Spanish government to see Spanish fortunes as being on the same side as the rebels. So Oliver Pollock and Margaret O'Brien are big supporters of the revolution, even though they live in New Orleans by that point.
Right. Interesting. And then you have a couple of folks in West Florida that you focus. It's interesting because it would be easy to take this kind of meta story of these empires, but you really, by focusing on individuals, really help us see this in a really clear way. We're talking with Kathleen Duval from the University of North Carolina about her book, Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. And we've been talking about some of these lives. So I guess James Bruce and Isabella Christie are the other folks you look at in West Florida, and what brings them there.
Right. So they're another couple, but they're living in British West Florida. James Bruce he served in the British Army, or in the British Armed Forces anyway, during the 7 Years' War, and was awarded land in reward for his services, for his service. And one of the places to get land in the British Empire at the end of the 7 Years' War was in this new to the British colony of West Florida, which had been part of French Louisiana before that. And so he went to West Florida and started to try to make his fortune there.
Where in West Florida?
So based in Pensacola, and then he acquired land on the lower Mississippi, not too far from Pensacola, but just to the northwest of there. Land, and bought and enslaved people, and so founded plantations to try to make his fortune off of those. Right. So he was from Scotland, and he married Isabella Christie, and so they both end up in Pensacola at the time of the Revolution, and there's the biggest battle of the revolution on the Gulf Coast is the siege of Pensacola. Right. Galvez leads the siege, and the Bruces are inside the town as it's being bombarded.
Now, do they stay after the Spanish seizure?
No. So Galvez is a tremendous he's great at public relations, and he widely appeals to West Floridians, white and black, British and otherwise, who've been living in British West Florida, and says, just be part of the Spanish Empire. We will give you land. We'll, you all have a place in the Spanish Empire, except a few people who seemed too close to the British government there, or the British armed forces there. And James Bruce is unfortunately for the Bruces, he is one of those. He was on basically the town council of Pensacola. So he'd been appointed by the crown to that. So the Bruces end up exiled from West Florida and England for a while. When I wrote the book, they seemed to not leave England. I sort of lost trace of them, but since then somebody emailed me who's a descendant of them and told me where Isabella's grave is, which is in Canada. So they made at least she and possibly they made their way to British Canada.
Wow. So back on this side of the ocean, but a much different climate. So, yeah.
Right, exactly. Although as Scots, they may have liked it better than
that's very true.
Pensacola.
Yeah. Pensacola is a tough place. Yeah. So beautiful place, but hard in the much of the year. So then what about Oliver Pollock and Margaret O'Brien? Do they stay in New Orleans?
Yeah, so they lent a lot of money to the American cause. And so they're broke at the end of the revolution, even though their side wins, right? They're broke at the end of the revolution from supporting it. They have to sell their house in New Orleans. Pollock travels to Virginia and to Philadelphia, New York, to argue to Congress to be repaid for all the money he lent them. He isn't completely successful. He ends up in a Spanish prison for a while. She gets kicked out of her house. They eventually end up in Pennsylvania. He runs for office and loses. By then, he's a Federalist, so he's on the wrong side of politics by the time he runs for office. So their fortunes, despite being so the Bruces are on the losing side of this war, the fortunes of the Pollocks aren't any better. They also end up having to leave their home and be in sort of transit for a while too. War is hard on people.
It really is.
Side you end up being on.
Really, and even if you're on the winning side,
right.
And then Petit-Jean from Mobile is another fascinating character, and he plays this role as kind of a spy, that is between the different sides.
So he's a Petit-Jean or Petit-Jean is different tellings. He's enslaved in Mobile, and so he's a British West Floridian as well, but very different from the Bruces. Very different possibilities in life. He's enslaved by probably a French family that is still in Mobile under the British. And slavery doesn't change under the British. If anything, it expands and becomes more secure. But for slaveholders, right? But he doesn't have to labor on a plantation. His job is as a cattle driver. So his work is most days he's on the outskirts of Mobile, keeping track of the cattle. He'll bring them in to Mobile when it's time for slaughter. As a result, he is an enslaved man who knows the region better than just about anybody else who's not native, right? He knows the swamps around Mobile. He knows the waterways. And so when the Spanish come, Galvez leads the forces to Mobile. There's a siege of Mobile and they take Mobile. I don't know exactly how it happens, but somebody under Galvez finds out about Petit-Jean and immediately realizes how valuable he could be to the Spanish army. So Petit-Jean becomes, as you said, a spy for the Spanish. He's a courier as well. The Spanish they're in ships and some of them are in tents on land. And so there's a lot of need for somebody who can carry messages from one to the other without getting caught. And, being enslaved, looking like an enslaved person, and yet knowing the place very well, serves Petit-Jean. It makes him the perfect spy courier. He spies on the Chickasaws, he spies on the British, and reports back to the Spanish. He, as a result of his service in the war, he gets his freedom. The Spanish award him buy his freedom. And they also help him he earns some money to buy his wife, and they help him negotiate to buy his wife as well. So he gets his and her freedom as a result.
Then do they stay in the area or do they go somewhere?
I think they do. They appear in the next couple of censuses, and then they start that it's not really his name, right? He's called Petit-Jean the whole way through. Right. And so it's possible that if I knew what the name is that he continued to use or started to use in censuses and such, I would be able to track. But I don't know his wife's name at all. Unfortunately, in the book I have to call him Petit-Jean's wife because that's the only thing she's referred to in anything I can get. But so there's a real bifurcation of in West Florida after the war, there is a much larger number of free people of color in that region, all along the Gulf Coast. Much of it as a result of the war, either the kind of service that Petit Jean did, or the Spanish enlist a lot of local, both free and enslaved African American men in the armed forces, and a lot of those get their freedom as a result. There's also under Spanish law, they're able to buy their own freedom if they can afford to, and there are more opportunities during the war to earn money. So as a result of that combination of things, there's a huge growth in sort of manumission or self-purchase, things that lead to a large population of free people of color. But at the same time, after the war, there is an importation of new enslaved people from Africa. So the enslaved population grows as well. So I think my guess would be Petit Jean and his family, because they're freed at the end of the war, become part of that sort of that long history that follows of free people of color in the region.
Right. So we're talking with Kathleen Duval, the author of Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. So this part, that is West Florida, becomes Spanish after the war. I'm always confused about who's
right. Exactly. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So at the Treaty of Paris, as we talked about before, so the British sort of joined sides with the United States, with the U.S. delegation at the Treaty of Paris, and argue for as far west and south a border for the United States as they can get. Spain is arguing for as small a United States as possible, and France is kind of trying to negotiate between them. But everybody agrees that the coast of West Florida has been won by Spain. So after the war, no matter which side you're on, you acknowledge that Spain has basically if you think of what's now the state of Florida, and then if you were to extend that panhandle all the way to the Mississippi River along the coasts of Alabama and Mississippi, that's what's generally acknowledged to be Spanish.
Right. And then how far north does it go?
So that's the debated part, right? Yeah. So Spain says it goes to the Ohio River. So basically it includes the those lands that have been fought, that the French and the British fought over in the 7 Years' War, that U.S. settlers have been pouring into before there was a United States. So that's untenable. They're not going to be able to claim to make that real.
Yeah.
So they probably about as far north as the Tennessee River, most people would say is about.
Significant territory.
It's a lot, right? And of course, on the ground, that's where Cherokees live. That's where Creeks live. Yeah. It actually doesn't belong to Spain. So in fact, in Spain in 1784, so right after the end of the Revolution, signs huge, large treaties with large nations in the era the region, with the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Creeks, that are basically mutual protection treaties. And there are any Spanish colonies and colonists in these places. And so Spain and these native nations agreed to support each other's claims to the region, which means, at least for the time being, means real control of the land in the hands of the native nations who live there, but trade and military supplies from Spain, in return for Spain being able to say, yeah, this really is ours, and it doesn't belong to the United States.
Interesting. But then, Georgia is claiming much of it and then some of it becomes states of, Tennessee and Kentucky.
Exactly. So. Right. So in at the end of 1780, beginning of the 1780s, at the end of the Revolution, Georgia really is only, of all the 13 colonies, it's the one that's considerably smaller than what it is today. It's just a sliver it's just basically Augusta and Savannah, and all the rest of that is Creek country, and so war continues for several years after the Revolution between the Creeks and Georgia until they settle on a border that's still nowhere near what Georgia's western border is today. But yes, as you know, over the following decades, settlers will pour into what becomes Kentucky, Tennessee, eventually Ohio, Alabama, Mississippi.
And that's kind of one of the themes of your book, then, this independence, dependence that happens as a result of the war, which changes things for everybody in this area.
Right, exactly. So this just for one example, this treaty between Spain and some of these native nations, it's the native nations sign it for the purpose of their own independence, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're talking with Kathleen Duval, author of Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. And you've also been helping us with the various ways of looking at underrepresented voices. As we can see from your book, I mean, you're looking at this from unique perspective and bringing in these folks like, Oliver Pollock and Pettyjean and Isabella Christie that otherwise we wouldn't see in the historical record, but they're part of this. So how does all of this tie in with rethinking the revolution, or rethinking what it means?
Right. Yeah. So some of it, I think, is just broadening who we consider a subject of the history of the American Revolution and of American history in general. That I think in recent decades there has been a real effort by historians and teachers of all sorts to bring in more and more voices, more and more perspectives, and see that it's a really exciting way to study history is to look at how different people thought about the same events.
Right.
There are also some very practical implications that happen because of this part of the war. After the siege of Pensacola, Spain wins the siege, and then immediately the ships, there are Spanish and French ships that had been besieging Pensacola, they immediately sail to the West Indies, and they relieve some of the French fleet that had been fighting there. Some of that French fleet is what goes straight up to Yorktown, and it's essential in the French and American forces winning the Battle of Yorktown. And Galvez himself goes on. He leads the next Spanish attack, which is on the Bahamas, on the British Bahamas. Spain takes the Bahamas from the British. So West Florida was the first non-rebelling colony that the British lost as a result of the war. Then the Bahamas, and then Galvez starts to bring all the forces together, land and sea forces, for an attack on Jamaica. And that's one of the many things that are going through the minds of British officials, the British public, as they move toward deciding to let the 13 colonies go, and they hope and they do protect Jamaica. There are also at a slightly earlier point in the war, there was a French and Spanish fleet that was on its way to Britain to attack England itself. It gets blown away by a storm, but that could happen again. And so the stakes of the war are big when France and Spain and the Netherlands get involved.
Oh yeah, it changes the whole dynamic. And of course, for the British, losing Massachusetts and Virginia was not such a big deal, but losing Jamaica would have been disastrous. Exactly. Right. I mean, South Carolina might hurt a little bit, but the rest of those 13 colonies, they don't bring much in. It's mostly pride, maybe mostly George III's pride. Right. Yeah.
But Jamaica is a different story. Yeah.
That is. Yeah, so looking at this then from the perspective of these people who are on the ground looking out, it does change the way we think about what's happening in this really interesting period.
Yeah. And I think it helps us think a little bit more about how people at the time thought of it. We sometimes, when historians are to blame for this, when we focus in, we pretend, we sort of create the impression that that's the way people at the time saw things. When people say we're aware of a global world. Certainly British officials had Spain and France on their minds when they made their decisions. And of course, that's the same is true of the people deciding to go from protest to rebellion. They, at every minute, wanted France and Spain on their side and arguably knew that they couldn't maybe they could persuade their empire to let them go, but they couldn't militarily defeat them without military and financial support from other empires.
Right. We're talking with Kathleen Duval, author of Independence Lost, and you also co-edited a book on voices from the colonial period, again, which looks at this with lots of different voices that we hear for the first time, really. And
Right, exactly. So the idea with that, it's called Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America. And the idea with that was to hear from more of these people in their own words. And particularly important in that is translations. So
Hmm.
I actually co-edited it with my dad, who is he's a literary translator, for a long time, was a professor at the University of Arkansas. He's retired now.
Wow.
And we wanted to make new translations of French and Spanish documents to make them really accessible for readers today, including for students today. And so he translated a lot of French and Spanish documents, some already quite well-known documents, but others that I'd come across in my research.
Hmm.
And then he, for a long time, he ran a literary translation program. And so he has students who can translate from lots and lots of different languages.
Wow.
So we have a new translation of an Icelandic saga that's about Vikings going to North America. There's a Dutch document. What else do we have? Oh, we've got a Russian. This is one of my favorite documents. It's Catherine the Great explaining why she thinks colonies are a waste of money and effort. Talk about perspective, like your perspective changing when you read something different. Here's a monarch. I've looked at this colonial thing and it looks like a waste to me.
Wow. Yeah. So was she right or wrong?
Her voice is strong.
Yeah. Wow. It's amazing what we find out, and particularly if you can read Russian or Icelandic.
Right. There's a lot out there that hasn't been looked at that much by people who don't. Right. It can't be read by people who don't read it.
Urban understanding the native languages and how the world seemed to these folks. I mean,
exactly. So that's something I've been trying to do more and more, and it's much easier these days because so many Native nations these days have language revitalization programs, have language classes that you can take online or in person. So it's easier. It's still not easy. It's always hard to learn a new language, and then these are languages that aren't related to English. So it's all starting from scratch for most of us. But yeah, that I think that is something that there in my generation, there are more and more people, more and more Americanists reading Dutch, French, Spanish, and that's clearly going to be the next generation's one of their great contributions will be really being able to read even more broadly. And it's not that for this era, they're not lots and lots of documents that haven't been read that are written in native languages, but there is this feeling that we have these translated speeches and things like that. And if you read one of those that was translated at the time into, from the speaker's native language into Spanish or French or English, and that native language, there's some translated words I think that we can start to think of in different ways. Like, oh, when he says this, he probably was thinking of this concept that means something sort of more complicated, maybe in the language he was coming from. But then for the 19th century and beyond, for the 19th century, certainly there are documents written in native languages in Cherokee and in other languages that really have been untapped by historians. And I think will teach us a lot.
It's amazing. So we're talking with Kathleen Duval, author of Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, as well as other books and essays on this topic, and is really helping to make us think anew about this whole era and looking at this from these different perspectives of both these individuals and these empires. And let me think, we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, anything else we should? I never asked about Armand Broussard, another of your characters.
Oh, right. There is one more. So one more character I followed. Armand Broussard. He was Acadian, so his family was French Canadian when Canada belonged to France. Over the course of the 7 Years' War, in which France lost Canada to Britain, he was a child, but he and his family were kicked out of Canada. They sort of bounce around a little bit, but end up in New Orleans. And they end up in New Orleans like practically the day after the Spanish have gotten Louisiana from France. So they expect Louisiana to still be French, and it's not. It's Spanish, but it is still Catholic. And it is desperately in need of settlers, according to what the crown wants to do there. And so the Acadians, including Broussard's family, were embraced in Spanish Louisiana, given land. They become the Cajuns. The keyword Cajun comes from Acadian. And so in, what is it, a decade or two later, Broussard by then is a young man. He's a young adult. And the war breaks out, and Galvez, his Spanish governor, is calling on people to fight against the British, and his family was kicked out of their homeland by the British and have been talking about it ever since. Right? Imprisoned, the whole family was imprisoned in Halifax for a year or so. And so he and all his cousins, they all volunteer for the militia. They end up in the battles along the Gulf Coast and very enthusiastically involved in the war effort. Galvez says the Acadians were the greatest fighters among his forces. And he's got regular troops as well as lots of different militia. And the Acadians, he said, were always first in line.
Wow.
In contrast to the Bruces in West Florida and the Pollocks in Louisiana, Broussard becomes very wealthy. He establishes a large plantation, also based on enslaved labor. So in this era after the Revolution, when the numbers of enslaved people, the numbers of plantations, the size of plantations, all of those things are growing in Louisiana. At the same time that freedom is coming to some enslaved people who've been in Louisiana or West Florida for a long time. So he builds a fortune, sort of the fortune off of slavery and plantations that the Bruces had hoped to and don't end up doing. Wow. He still he built basically the biggest plantation house in that era of Louisiana's history. Of course, there were bigger ones in the antebellum history period, but.
So it was somewhere around New Orleans, up the river from New Orleans?
Right. Just barely north of New Orleans, just upriver from. Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, we've talked about Irish, Scots, French. I mean, all these people who really don't like the British Empire in this area.
Right. That's what they have in common, and increasingly in this period, that's what most American Indians around them are thinking too. Right. We don't like the British Empire, or we don't like the settlers coming out of the British colonies that become the United States.
Right. They would have been almost universally thought of as English, these now Americans who are rebelling.
Yeah, exactly. Right. English, and to the Scots especially, it's important to make that distinction.
The fact that you have Alexander MacGillivray, a Scottish guy who's a leader of the Creeks, because his mother was a Creek. So his mother's Creek. He speaks Creek, although there's some people who say, his Creek wasn't really that great, but I don't know. So, but he definitely spoke English too and wrote in English. And his father was a Scottish merchant who was on the side of the British when the war broke out. He actually got kicked out of. He was living in Georgia and got kicked out of Georgia and had to go back to Britain. So I don't think MacGillivray has much connection after that with. No. So he becomes sort of over the course of the war and in the decades after the war, Alexander MacGillivray becomes more and more Creek, really. Right.
Among the Creeks.
And then he negotiates with the Americans in Philadelphia.
Yeah. So he basically becomes, I think, the Creeks at this point are they're a confederacy. They're still fairly town-based in how they make their decisions, including about whether to go to war. MacGillivray, I think, becomes what we would think of as an emissary that the Creeks appoint to negotiate with outsiders, with English-speaking outsiders and Spanish-speaking outsiders, because he negotiates with Spain too. And that's certainly how the outsiders see him. He's appointed actually to be an official negotiator for Britain and later for Spain.
Right.
With the Creeks. So he negotiates a treaty in New York that ends the Creek-Georgia War and promises that the Creeks can retain their homeland. It doesn't last that long, but it's a diplomatic success at the time that he negotiates it. And then he tries to create at the time there's this Ohio Valley Confederacy of Shawnees and others in the Ohio Valley. He tries to create a parallel one in the South with the Cherokees and the Chickasaws and Choctaws and smaller groups as well. He's completely unsuccessful, though. People sort of outside of the Creeks, they see him as really interfering with their national independence, like telling Chickasaws what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And Tecumseh later will try to do a similar thing.
Right. And similarly fail with most people. I mean, I think that's one of the things, when an outsider comes to the Chickasaws and proposes a military alliance, that can be accepted. But when they come and say, really, you should be under me, we should all be kind of the same and I should be in charge, that they're still independent nations. They're still, sovereign nations today. And then that was, that's a huge barrier that Tecumseh and others run into is the continuing nationalities.
It's interesting because if we think about the Albany Conference was sparked because these British colonies weren't getting along with each other, and they saw that the Iroquois were doing it. They needed to shore up the relationship with the Iroquois. And then in this period we're talking about, the British colonies do figure out a way to work together. And these folks other than the Iroquois, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Shawnee, see this real obstacles to
it's right. And I think there's in some ways it's how they survive till today. It's why there's still a Chickasaw nation today, and all their Cherokee nations today. If they'd all banded together, maybe they wouldn't still have these languages that they're revitalizing today and such. On the other hand, I've been working in my current book goes a little bit later into the 19th century. And there are some really successful efforts to band together, to really start to make foreign policy decisions together, including after some of the nations that are removed to Indian territory. They still have fairly, for the most part, fairly large land bases there. And for a while, at least, there aren't a lot of Americans there. And so there are some, I think, more successful efforts to make really strong alliances there, and also in their relationships with Plains Indians, and there's just really fascinating diplomacy going out there in the West in the early 19th century, through the mid 19th century. And I think, if I were just to overgeneralize, when it tends to be successful were things like in the Ohio Valley and out west a little bit later, when they're really more seen as equal alliances or alliances between nations without some central leader trying to bring everybody together in a way that feels like a takeover rather than a traditional alliance, but maybe just a little firmer than in the past.
Interesting. We've been talking with Kathleen Duval, author of Independence Lost: Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. And now you've really gotten us interested in the next book, which is exploring all kinds of interesting things. So thank you so much for joining us, Kathleen.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer. And I want to remind everyone, if you have an idea for something you'd like to hear about, an episode, send me an email, rallison@suffolk.edu. And I just want to, we have listeners all over the world and all over the country. We thought we'd just have a handful of folks in and around Boston, but I want to thank our friends in Thailand and the UK, especially, and Norway, as well as in Hurricane, West Virginia, Queen Creek, Arizona, Rayford, Florida, Ball Grounds, Georgia, Greenbrier, Arkansas. Do you know where Greenbrier is?
I do.
Pasadena, Maryland, Long Beach, California, and all places in between. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.